Hi there, this is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, and welcome to another episode of Turkey Love. I haven't had any turkey love for quite some time, but today's turkey comes from 1977, and it's Michael Anderson's Orca, the killer whale. Now, personally, I don't think this is a turkey, but it was always kind of had the reputation of being a turkey because it looks very much like a Jaws rip-off. Obviously made just 2 years after Spielberg's blockbuster, but in a lot of ways this is actually better than Jaws, deeper than Jaws on some level. I mean, I still prefer Jaws, but when you think about it, Jaws, as I've said myself, is one of the greatest films of moments. It's just like classic scene after classic scene after classic scene. But what is Jaws really actually about? Whereas Orca, or Orca the killer whale, is just so deep and about so many things. Directed by Michael Anderson, who did The Dam Busters and Logan's Run, and The Quiller Memorandum and Around the World in 80 Days, and did a series of remakes back when they were kind of called remakes and not reboots. He did a version of 1984. He did a version of The Sea Wolf, the Edward G. Robinson film, obviously not with Edward G. Robinson. He did a version of Pinocchio. He did a version of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. But he's one of those directors that's never really talked about because, again, a kind of just jobbing director, I guess. This stars Richard Harris as Nolan, who's essentially the Quint character. Charlotte Rampling as a whale expert, Bo Derek as a seaman's mate, Robert Carradine's in this, Keenan Wynn is in this, Will Sampson is in this. Obviously he got out of the mental institution at the end of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and became a village person in Newfoundland. This was co-written by Sergio Donati. It's a Dino De Laurentiis co-production, but Donati more famous for writing or co-writing Fistful of Dynamite, Once Upon a Time in the West with Leone, The Big Gun Down, Shoot First, Die Later, and it was also a co-writing credit on the film by Robert Towne, who's obviously famous as a script doctor and also famous for Chinatown. And obviously the boat in Jaws is called the Orca, and the boat in this is called Bumpo, which of course is Native American for Jaws. I think I maybe just made that up. So how is this better than Jaws? Well, I do think in some levels there's actually characters go on a journey in this film. Multiple characters actually have a journey. Quint going from I'll never wear a life jacket again to putting on a life jacket isn't that much of a journey in Jaws, really. It's not as if Chief Brody suddenly loves the water at the end of Jaws. Whereas Richard Harris's character and Charlotte Rampling's character do go on an evolution. They do actually go on a character arc in Orca. I mean, the first thing that Orca does better than Jaws is obviously the killer whale footage is far more realistic because they're not using a robotic killer whale in most of the film. I mean, obviously there's tank shots and you can tell that it's the killer whale's in a tank, and it was obviously trained because you can train killer whales, you can't train great white sharks. So, I mean, obviously it gets a little bit silly at the end but most films do tend to get a little bit silly at the end. So the upshot is Richard Harris is a fisherman who's after great white sharks to get money to put them into enclosures, and during this hunt of great white shark, Charlotte Rampling and Robert Carradine, who are divers, get in the way. Robert Carradine falls in the water. The great white's about to bite him where the sun don't shine, and a killer whale comes in and kills the shark. I would say this film's probably a little bit more scientifically accurate than Jaws. There are tales of dolphins doing this, saving humans. I don't know why they'd want to save humans, but never mind. So the Orca saves Robert Carradine's character, and then Richard Harris gets this idea, wow, I could get more money for an orca to sell. So he goes on the hunt for a pod of killer whales, even though Charlotte Rampling gets really annoyed at him, obviously, and suggests all these things like, killer whales are just like humans and have a lot more in common than humans, and their brains a little bit bigger than humans. They believe in the family unit just like humans. There's a completely pointless Charlotte Rampling voiceover for some reason, obviously to explain to the audience what's going on. It happens about 3 or 4 times and it's just completely unnecessary, but I'm guessing that was less to do with Michael Anderson and more to do with the producers. So that's certainly something that Jaws doesn't have, is a pointless voiceover. But he goes out, he finds this pod of whales, and he tries to capture the male, but he skewers the female, gets her on board. It is a fairly distressing scene, and probably one that, if you weren't against whale fishing or shark fishing, especially whale fishing because they're just like us, you will be after it. And we learned that the female was actually pregnant in fairly gruesome, almost Cronenbergian ways, and this enrages the male killer whale, who, as we find out from Charlotte Rampling, because killer whales are just like us, they believe in vengeance, and therefore the killer whale Orca goes on a wild rampage to get revenge and have a mano o whale finale at the end. Now this might sound like a turkey, but I think it's a lot more than a turkey, but I think it has this perception of being a turkey, like I said, because it's a Jaws rip-off. But as I say, there's a lot of ways it actually does better than Jaws. So Richard Harris starts off as this fairly ignorant, killing these creatures or capturing these creatures is just a way to make money. Obviously fishermen do that, but he's more of a kind of big game fisherman. That doesn't really make any sense, but never mind. But slowly he actually reads books. Charlotte Rampling actually gives him books on whales, and he actually learns a bit more about them, and he does kind of change. He does try and start to think like the whale. In the end, there's a wonderful fatalism. There's a fatalistic element to his character, because he kind of knows, as he keeps pushing the boat and they end up in colder waters, there's a fatalism to Harris's character, because he knows he's not getting back from this. In some way he has to atone. We learn something about his past, that perhaps he has a commonality with the killer whale, And then Charlotte Rampling, who just does her most intense Ramplingisms. She actually becomes more emotional as the film goes on, because at the start she is that stoic, intense scientist, but over as we get to the end of the film, she actually becomes more emotional and becomes a much more freer person, probably due to all the dead bodies around her. And I also love the fact there's not a romance. The romance is between his Harris's second mate and the Bo Derek character. So there's no romance between Rampling and Harris. They both are at loggerheads throughout most of the film. And the only time as Charlotte Rampling kind of gets a little bit more human, a little bit more emotional, she just comforts him with her body heat. But there's no naughty business between the two of them, which I kind of like as well, because other films of this kind would automatically have them as we hate each other, but then they end up sleeping with each other. This doesn't happen in Orca the Killer Whale. So I mean, there's a lot to like. Of course it gets a little bit silly at the end. Of course some of the things that Orca does are a little bit far-fetched. A couple of the deaths are unintentionally funny. But there's a lot to like. Again, there's a Scream Factory Blu-ray release of this in the States. This is the Umbrella Entertainment Blu-ray, which I picked up recently in the Umbrella Entertainment sale. But I do think, of course, Jaws is the better film. It's got all those classic lines, classic moments. But I do think Orca the Killer Whale has been neglected. This could have been in, Turkey Love or Neglected Gem. I wouldn't necessarily call it a gem, but I think it's a turkey, but it doesn't really deserve to have the turkey designation. Because as I say, I think it does have a bit more depth than Jaws does, in actual fact, as far as character development, as far as the themes of actual family, and and obviously Jaws did a lot to hurt the image of the great white, from this cuddly creature to this vengeful killing machine. And obviously millions of sharks still get killed every day, and also the great white was demonised, whereas because the orca is a mammal, killer whales believe in family, unlike great white sharks who piss on the structure of marriage and family. And because Charlotte Rampling keeps going on about how human they are and their human behaviour, and so it's interesting that the killer whale in this, you're kind of on its side, so it's not demonised in the film the way a lot of animal on the Rampage films, you side with the human. In Orca the Killer Whale, you're probably on the side of the whale. So that's an interesting dynamic that's different from Jaws as well. So thanks very much for watching this episode of Turkey Love, even though it's more just an episode of whale love rather than turkey love, because as I said, I think Orca the Killer Whale's rather good. I think it holds up pretty well all these years later. But please let me know what you think. Is it a turkey or is it a whale of a time? So this is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, going back to a punnery and saying farewell.